16. "Archers, let fly!" King Whitsun shouted, and they did. From Lily and Natalia the arrows flew up. The birds banked at the last moment, and most of the hail missed. Yet some found their mark, and a few satisfying splashes followed as some of the foremost monsters spun into the water, but many others came. Arrows whizzed between them and glanced off their armor. In their feet they bore torches and little flaming pots. The enemy descended, swooping overhead, dropping their fiery burdens on the ships. These burst in small explosions and spread. All three ships were fighting fires at once. But the mass of the dark force flew ahead, past the ships, toward Settledon. Fleck watched in horror. In a few panicked moments, fire rained down on Settledon. "There are at least 100 of them," Whitsun said, taking charge of Lander again. "And their fire catches and grows, so they have some evil art with it." The black force banked over Settledon, and most flew back with great speed toward the ships. Others dropped deftly in and tore through the town. Terrified cries and a noise of destruction came to them over the water. "Vile monsters!" Fleck shouted. "Come to us!" They could not have heard him, but they did come, and in tremendous numbers. Nearly all the rabbits fled the tops, and many made for the hatchways and dove below deck. Most of those remaining were huddled on the deck, looking for some small place of refuge. The monsters beat their wings and raced toward Lily. Against every instinct, Fleck began to climb the rigging. The noise of their wings grew as strong as a storm. Fleck reached the foremast yard top, just below the red diamond standard of King Whitsun Mariner. He drew his sword. The leaders headed straight for him, screeching as they came and extending their horrible talons. He didn't wait for them to find him. He drew his sword and leapt. Swinging wildly, he met the enemy aloft. His strokes all but one met air. The one found a black breastplate. Its owner clawed at Fleck as he fell. 2 sets of talons tore at him, and then the birds veered off. He fell, spinning into the water. Battered and cut, he plunged below the surface. After a painful few seconds, he forced his way up and emerged. He looked up and around, surveying the hopeless scene. Pain screamed for his attention, but he pushed it away. All 3 ships were engulfed in flames. Chaos reigned on Lily's deck. The attack was concentrated there. He found a net slung over the side and he climbed, pain screaming with every inch, and at last tumbled onto the deck. There he saw several knots of fighting rabbits, their swords slicing the air. The deck was littered with the fallen, and in the midst of it stood the king and the prince, fighting for their lives. Around them fought several of the bucks of Black Star Company, including Burnley and Kajak. Captain Vance and Joyner were there as well, desperately defending alongside the miners. Burnley swung his massive axe, making contact at times, but receiving too many wounds in return. He was a wall before his king and prince, but he was crumbling. King Whitsun himself fought hard, keeping Lander between him and the valiant, wounded Burnley. Fleck saw Massey defending poor Gavin near the hatchway. Gavin could barely stand. Massey dealt death with his bow, and Fleck saw that some of the fallen fowl were riddled with arrows. But Massey was running out of arrows, and 3 birds fell on him at once. Fleck despaired. In a fraction of a second, he considered his awful choices. If he went to the king, no one would be there to help Massey and Gavin. He ran for Massey. As he neared them, he leapt onto a pile of ropes and sprang into the air, driving his shoulder into the nearest bird of prey. It knocked sideways into its partner, and both fell askew on deck, momentarily stunned. Fleck fell hard to the deck behind Massey and Gavin. The 3rd bird came for Massey, who drew his sword and made an errant swipe at it. His attacker beat his wings, halting in mid-air, while Massey nearly fell over with his heavy, hapless stroke. The bird beat his wings again and burst onto Massey, clawing him and striking out with his beak. Fleck rose, grabbing a discarded sword from the deck. He dove, sword foremost, and buried it in the bird's shoulder. Screeching with agony, the monster released Massey, flew sideways over the rail, and crashed into the lake. Massey was wounded, and Gavin wasn't moving. Fleck glanced at the king under heavy attack from 10 birds, as the bucks around him fell one by one. Burnley lay motionless in front of Prince Lander, who was now exposed to attack. Fleck pushed Gavin to the hatchway. "Get him below!" he ordered Massey. Fleck drove his aching body toward the command deck. He dodged blows from frenzied friends and terrible foes alike, and finally came to fill Burnley's spot. Swinging his sword in a wide arc, he beat back the attack of a furious bird bent on snatching the young prince. Galt was nearby, trying to avoid being killed or snatched by a pair of hideously large birds. Fleck's heart sank when he realized Galt had become like a plaything to them. His fury rose at seeing the friend of his youth, his lieutenant and partner, being so abused. He dropped his sword and reached for Burnley's axe, which now lay on the deck beside the fallen miner. With a tremendous effort, he drew the axe behind his head and hurled it at Galt's two attackers. The axe collided with the foremost, sending him toppling over the side, while the other's expression changed from playful to deadly, and he came at Fleck with such force and speed that the valiant rabbit had no chance. His bloody beak extended, striking Fleck's shoulder and rolling him over painfully. Fleck felt talons fasten on him, heard and felt the whoosh of beating wings. Then the deck grew smaller as he was lifted into the sky. Fleck fought to stay conscious. He saw that Galt had been grabbed as well. Both were rising over the water in the clutches of hideous birds. Fleck felt for his sword, but it was not there. He did have a knife, which he strained to reach without effect. He scanned the shrinking deck, looking for any sign of hope. The last thing he saw was Massey standing on deck, wounded but determined, a flame illuminating the tip of a nocked arrow. Massey was aiming right at Fleck. He let go, and the arrow sped upward, flame stretching thin in flight. Fleck felt it whiz past his face and heard it sink with a hiss into his captor. The suffocating pain of the talon grip eased, then fell away, and Fleck dropped to the water. He had been dropped just short of Dobble's point. He could barely breathe. He felt torn in half. He swam for the shore and heard an agonizing screech, followed by two heavy splashes just behind him. Chapter 17. Two soaked and battered rabbits washed up on the shore of Amon Lake. Gasping, Fleck crawled to the stony beach, rolled over and tried to clear his head. Galt was already standing. "We have to go, Fleck," he said, eyes darting from the lake to the tree line. "I'm no traitor," Fleck managed to say through ragged breaths. "Traitor?" Galt cried. "The winning side gets to decide who the traitors were. We've lost, Fleck. It's over. Even you, Captain Blackstar, can do nothing this time. We have no chance." We have no chance?" "He has no chance," Galt said, head down, edging toward the forest. Fleck stood slowly, staggering. The usually gray fur of his arm was splotched with dark scarlet. One eye was swollen shut. "He can be saved," Fleck said, reaching for his sword. His hand closed on air. His scabbard was empty. "Nothing," Galt said. "There's nothing we can do. It's the end of the world. The end of the world. But the oath, Galt, remember. We can still turn this. King Whitson needs us. Prince Lander needs us," he said, pointing to the burning ship. "I'll never turn traitor." "You're only a traitor if you betray yourself," Galt said. He sprinted off, disappearing into the trees. Fleck struggled to stay upright. Swaying, he turned from the fleeing rabbit to face the lake. Charcoal smoke corkscrewed into the sky. The blackened ship teemed with enemies. Flames snapped at the red diamond standard as the last king's bucks grappled with the invaders on the deck. Whitson Mariner stood among them, his sword poised and his harried shouts echoing over the lake. Fleck straightened and stretched his arm. Pain flared. Unbearable agony. He bent, wincing. He opened his eyes and saw King Whitson, fighting desperately to protect Prince Lander. Fleck rose, ignoring the pain, and shouted across the water, "My place beside you! My blood for yours! Till the green ember rises or the end of the world!" Swordless, Fleck Blackstar hobbled to the water's edge and plunged in. After an agonizing swim, he reached Lily and climbed up the net that still hung over the edge of the burning ship. He looked across the water to Settledon and winced at the flaming ruin it was fast becoming. The enemy's attack now centered on the three ships, and primarily on Lily, the largest. But instead of going on deck where enemies multiplied, he climbed through a porthole and discovered a huddling band of rabbits below deck. "What are you doing here?" he shouted. "Get on deck now and fight for your king!" Many were shamed and heeded his call, including poor Gavin, who roused himself for a final, futile act of courage. Others slunk into the corners. Fleck searched for a sword but found none. He grabbed a pickaxe from the now useless supplies he had checked only that morning. He charged for the ladder, pickaxe in hand, and began to climb. But he stopped, hearing the baneful screams from above. He looked back at the supplies. "Gavin!" he shouted at the rabbit, who was just now reaching the top of the ladder. "Come back!" "But, Captain," Gavin said weakly, "I want to die up there, not down here like a coward." "Come down at once!" Gavin obeyed as quickly as he was able. Fleck climbed the ladder and stuck his head above deck, where chaos, blood, and fire reigned. He couldn't see as far as the command deck, but the latecomers he had roused from below deck had made a small opening in the mass of monsters. Fleck reached for a rolling torch and grabbed one, then disappeared below. He handed Gavin the torch and motioned for him to stand back. Fleck crossed the hold and swung his axe, breaking open a blast powder barrel and spilling a quantity of the powder on the floor. Then he hurled the barrel into the corner, where it rammed into the other barrels, split, and spilled its powder in a heap. "Time for fire," he said to Gavin, taking the torch from the weary, smiling rabbit. "Now up top and do what you can, then over the edge, Gavin." The frail rabbit nodded and pulled himself up the ladder. When Gavin was through the hatch, Fleck dropped the torch. Flame met powder and sparked to life, racing along the trail toward the large stack of barrels in the corner of the hold. Fleck was already gone. Emerging from the hatch with a fierce cry, he ran for the command deck. He shouted as he went, his hoarse voice rising over the wild cacophony of battle. "Burn out! Burn out!" he cried, and the cry was taken up by the few miners left alive on board. "Burn out!" He raced to the command deck and saw with alarm that Prince Lander was gone. He spun and searched the sky, but he could not locate the prince. He screamed and turned toward the command deck. The king was surrounded by 5 laughing monsters, his sword broken in 2 and his face awash in pain. Fleck surged ahead, the devastation on deck fueling his boiling rage, intent on only one thing. He broke through the band of attackers and plowed into the king, carrying him over the side. The birds screeched and struck out madly at the pair, but they were over the rail and falling to the water when it came. A shattering crack resounded over the lake. The ship came apart in a terrific burst of bright fire. Fleck drove King Whitson down, sheltering him from the countless splintered shards that filled the sky and hit the water like so many arrows. A few found Fleck, and he reeled, at last losing his grip on the king. He was losing his hold on life. He tried to swim, but his vision blurred, black stars multiplying before his eyes until all was dark and he sank, forgetting everything. Chapter 18. Whitson broke the lake's surface and saw that Fleck was sinking. He wasted no time. He dove, his long feet beating as he plunged again into the roiling water. He grabbed Fleck and with a tremendous effort drew him back to the surface. Whitson inhaled deeply and took a moment to survey the frenzied scene. He only had a few seconds, but he made several decisions in that moment. Lily was utterly destroyed, and a quarter of Natalia had been blown apart. It was listing starboard, and most of its remaining deck was on fire. Vanguard was closer to shore, on fire and badly damaged, but the king believed it might be saved. The enemies, those few who had survived, were retreating across the water. None even looked back. A few brave rabbits stood on the deck of the ruined Natalia and shot volley after volley of arrows at the retreating birds. All this the king saw in the space of 3 seconds. Then his most pressing concern returned to him in a surge of panic. Where is Lander? Wood debris in every shape and size was scattered on the surface of the lake. Rabbits for a half-mile rode on the wreckage, trying to make either Dobble's Point or the shore at Settledon. A few rabbits nearby were holding onto a raft-sized section of the ruined ship, which curved up on the side. Whitson recognized it as the port side hull, reinforced and slick with lake scum. He delivered Captain Blackstar into their care, motioned for them to take him to shore, and swam back toward the burning, bobbing wreckage of Lily, calling as he swam, "Lander! Lander, son!" He beat at the water, swimming madly into the messiest part of the wreckage, coming up to scan and shout, then diving in again. "Lander!" he cried. Whitson listened for an answer, but he could hardly hear anything. Since the blast, his ears had felt full of sawdust, and they rang with a solitary, ceaseless note. "Lander, do you hear me, son?" Small boats embarked from Vanguard and a few from the shore. Their crews dragged haggard rabbits from the red-stained lake. These they returned to the shore, where volunteers did all they could to save and care for the survivors. The raft bearing Captain Blackstar met with a boat, and after a brief exchange, the rabbits on board rowed furiously toward the king. When they reached him, Whitson was beginning to fade. His weary cries of "Lander! Lander, my son!" had fallen to weak and desperate whispers. Lord Grant was at the prow. He ordered the oarsmen to bring the boat alongside the king. They hauled him in, and Lord Grant took off his own large cape and wrapped the king in it. "Quickly now," he called. "Back to shore." "Lander," the king called weakly. "My only son." "Perhaps he's been found, your majesty," Lord Grant said, giving the king a drink from a skin. But his worried face told Whitson he had little hope. The blast had saved so many, but many more had lost their lives, and the prince was nowhere to be seen. In a few minutes the boat reached the shallow shore, and Whitson, somewhat recovered, climbed off the boat. There was wild disorder on the shore. Rabbits converged from the ruined town, the battered and blasted ships, and the lake. The lake and shore alike were busy with urgent activity, but several rabbits were still. Motionless soldiers lay along the beach. Soaked sailors, whose ceaseless coughing was strangely reassuring, lay beside them. Whitson hurried past them. He came to a clustered huddle of nobles, half burned and bloodied, but busy with the task of leading this recovery. "Your Majesty!" Lord Jamin called, and the whole group gathered around him, some near tears. "We thought you were lost, sir." "Where's Lily?" Whitson asked, sparing them a weary smile. "And Lander, has he come ashore?" Lord Jamin smiled and pointed. The nobles gave way, and a path between them opened. There, sitting on the shore, was Prince Lander. He was wet, of course, but otherwise he looked fine. Queen Lily knelt beside him, speaking into the ear of what looked like a lifeless rabbit. Whitson ran to them, tears filling his eyes. Chapter 19. Fleck awoke, starting up suddenly, his pulse quickening. "Relax, Captain," someone said. "The battle is over. You saved us." Fleck turned to see King Whitson alongside Dr. Grimes, who was forcing a bedraggled white rabbit to drink. "Gavin," Fleck said, a smile appearing on his worn and beaten face. "He'll be all right," Dr. Grimes said. "Just don't get him excited. You might make it as well, if you'll hold still." Fleck closed his eyes. The bright sky and the constant motion of the lake had made his vision blur, and his mind swim. "I'll just lie down," he said, falling back with a crunch. He groaned. "My back! It feels all—" "Stabbed up," King Whitson said. "It should. You shielded me from the blast. And Dr. Grimes just pulled a few sharp chunks of wood out of your poor back. She stitched you up, but you'll want to lie back easier next time." Fleck nodded, his mind barely able to make sense of what he heard. Then he sat up again, too quickly. "The prince!" "I'm here, Captain," Prince Lander said, his voice coming from over near Gavin. "I'm just helping Mr. Gavin. Then I'll come and see you as soon as ever I can, sir." Fleck laughed. It was a happy, almost delirious laugh. "Your Royal Highness, I am so gratified. I am so honored, and—" He trailed off as the king slowly lowered him back onto the blanket. When Fleck woke again, he peered out uneasily from small slits and saw that the prince loomed above him. A bright emerald dangled from Lander's neck. The queen stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. "Am I dead?" Fleck asked. "I don't think so," Prince Lander said, kneeling beside him. "I think you're just busted up real good." "Dr. Grimes says you should be better in a few weeks," the king said, kneeling down beside his son. "Gavin?" "Gavin is doing very well," Queen Lily said, smiling. "He saved me, you know," Prince Lander said. "Gavin took me off the ship before the blast." "He did?" Fleck asked, his smile reappearing. "What a very good rabbit Gavin is." I'm honored to be in his company. Am I still allowed in Black Star Company? Prince Lander asked. Will I get a star patch? Yes, sir, Fleck said. You shall have one this instant. Fleck's father's jacket was shredded and bloody and torn all over. He pulled at the sleeve and it came away easily. The patch was black, surrounded with scarlet. He offered it to the prince. Not your father's patch, Fleck, King Whitson said. I want him to have it, Fleck said, pressing it into the prince's hands. This was my father's patch. He was a hero. So you are like your father? The prince asked, his eyes wide as he reverently received the patch. He is, King Whitson said. I am, Fleck whispered. The funerals were many and sad. King Whitson stood at each graveside in turn, clasping Lander's hand. Burnley, Captain Vance, and many others were laid to rest. Fleck hobbled to each service. It took him a long time to recover, but in time he did. They did not see their enemies again for half a year. By then, much had changed. Fleck took Burnley's Black Star patch for his own. It went on his shoulder, on a new coat made by Queen Lily herself. A black star also adorned the tunic she made for him, serving as the sign of his coat of arms. King Whitson had made him a lord. Whitson was more active than ever. His heroic reputation grew, and the community found a way to recover after the calamitous attack of Amon Lake. Fleck stayed behind when the king led most of the community west in search of a new home. It was hard for King Whitson to leave Settledon, but it was a ruin, and he knew they needed to press farther into Natalia, away from the high Bleaks. Fleck had a writ from Whitson stating he was to command the mine and build a deep, secure warren nearby. Lord Blackstar was charged with defense and industry in the place he named Kingston. The mine was called Burnley's Colliery. Gavin stayed. Hollis stayed. Breffin, Kajak, and the other survivors of Blackstar Company stayed, along with more brave families intent on building a new community. Massey was asked to travel with the king and, when they reached their final home, to return to Kingston with news of where the main body of rabbits had settled. Fleck had wanted to go, to stay with the king and his family and to defend them always, but Whitson now believed it was too dangerous for them all to remain in only one company. Had it not been for Fleck's heroics, the Battle of Amon Lake could have wiped them all out. So he appointed Fleck as Lord Blackstar and charged him and his rabbits to build a new community. The community at Kingston would long remember the way the king left and what he said when they sailed away. King Whitson stood on the command deck of Vanguard, Lander at his side. The entire ship's crew stood at attention along the rails. Captain Walters cried, "Pass the word for silence! The king will speak!" There was no need for this order. No one moved, let alone dared talk. King Whitson stood at the rail, his crown glittering in the sunlight. On the shore, Lord Blackstar knelt, along with every member of his community, Gavin at his side. Whitson called across the water, "Fleck, my friend!" "My king!" Fleck called. Then he fell silent. The king spoke again, shouting across the water, "My place beside you! My blood for yours! Till the green ember rises, or the end of the world." Epilogue. Whitson Mariner embarked on many more adventures, and these are recorded in the Tales of Old Natalia. But he never forgot Captain Blackstar, and he made certain that Fleck's memory lived on. Every year, upon the anniversary of the battle, Whitson would remind his subjects of what Fleck had done. He would especially recount those deeds to Prince Lander and the other youngsters. Rabbit children, through the following decades, from Amon Lake to the eventual site of First Warren and beyond, heard stories of bravery. They heard stories to make them brave. They heard tales of the Black Star of Kingston, and with those tales came Blackstar's oath, often repeated, so that it became the creed of all those loyal to Whitson and his line. "My place beside you, my blood for yours, till the green ember rises, or the end of the world." The end. This has been The Black Star of Kingston, written by S.D. Smith. Narrated by Eric Fritzhughes. Copyright 2015 Story Warren Books. Production copyright 2015 by Story Warren Books and Mr. Herman's Production Company Limited. If you would like more stories by S.D. Smith, including the full-length novel The Green Ember, visit storywarren.com.